Opening the center. d4 immediately stakes a claim for central influence and prepares for pawn advances. Developing the knight to f6 immediately contests the center and prepares for queenside expansion, setting a flexible tone for the game. Claiming central space. White immediately challenges black's flexible knight and prepares to support the d-pawn, fostering piece development. Developing the kingside fianchetto often signals long-term ambitions for pawn breaks and robust piece play. Developing the knight to c3 solidifies central control, preparing for a potential pawn push or further piece activity on the kingside. Developing the bishop to its long diagonal immediately prepares for castling and supports potential central pawn breaks. Solidifying the center. White claims crucial central space, preparing a kingside pawn storm or rapid development. Solidifying the center and preparing for kingside fianchetto expansion. Solidifying central control and preparing kingside castling. White reinforces the pawn structure while keeping options open for further development. Securing the king is paramount, initiating development's vital next phase with this crucial castle. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling. This development aims to maintain a harmonious pawn structure and give the king safety, while quietly influencing the crucial e4-e5 square and potentially supporting an eventual f2-f4 pawn advance. Challenging the center immediately opens avenues for both sides, potentially leading to sharp, tactical skirmishes or a more strategic maneuvering game depending on White's response. Securing the kingside with this castling maneuver significantly enhances White's defensive structure and prepares for active piece play in the center, effectively concluding the initial development phase. Developing the knight to c6 firmly challenges White's central pawn structure and prepares to contest the d4 square, aiming for a harmonious piece deployment. Pushing the pawn to d5 immediately locks down the center, creating a spatial advantage for White and forcing Black's knight to find a new square, potentially impacting its development and coordination on the queenside. Shifting the knight to e7 prepares to challenge White's central pawn chain, aiming to free the bishop on g7 and potentially support a f5 advance for counterplay. Positioning the knight on d2 is a patient repositioning, preparing to reinforce the central pawn chain or potentially swing to f3 to attack the kingside. It's a strategic delay, allowing Black to reveal their intentions further while White solidifies their core. This quiet maneuver aims to build pressure without immediate confrontation, probing the queenside for weaknesses. This maneuver aims to disrupt White's harmonious pawn structure and potentially open lines for counterplay before White can fully consolidate their central space advantage. Securing the queenside pawn structure against potential incursions is the primary aim here, aiming to preemptively block Black's aggressive pawn thrusts and maintain territorial integrity. Knight redeployment to d7 aims to bolster the central pawn structure and prepares a potential advance of the e-pawn, injecting dynamic possibilities into this otherwise solid King's Indian setup. Initiating a queenside expansion. This rook lift from the corner aims to challenge Black's solid pawn structure and potentially create outposts on b6 or b7, while also preparing for a future b4 push to gain crucial queenside space. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside with f5 is a bold declaration, directly challenging White's central control and aiming to pry open lines towards the enemy monarch. This aggressive maneuver sacrifices pawn structure for initiative, seeking to exploit any potential backwardness in White's setup or unpreparedness on the queenside. The underlying idea is to create immediate dynamic counterplay, forcing white to react and potentially defend rather than continue their planned development or queenside expansion. However, this ambitious thrust also weakens black's kingside considerably, inviting tactical complications and potentially exposing the king if white can skillfully exploit the opened avenues. The success of this gambit hinges on black's ability to coordinate pieces effectively for a swift attack and white's capacity to weather the storm and capitalize on the ensuing weaknesses. Unlocking the queenside is the immediate objective, aiming to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially create a passed pawn later on. This pawn sacrifice opens a diagonal for the rook and challenges black's control of the queenside territory. White is essentially forcing a pawn confrontation, betting that the resulting open lines will favor their piece activity more than black's consolidated structure. It's a proactive attempt to gain space and initiative, steering the game away from a potential kingside attack black might be preparing with their advanced pawns. Securing the king's escape route. This seemingly passive maneuver offers a valuable safety valve should white's queenside pawn storm on the b-file eventually crack open the kingside defense. It also subtly prepares for potential counterplay by creating a slight diagonal for the rook. Solidifying the central pawn chain's integrity becomes paramount after black's aggressive pawn thrust. Rerouting the knight to g8, a seemingly passive maneuver, actually prepares for a deep regrouping, aiming to untangle black's cramped queenside and potentially launch a counter-offensive on the kingside where white's pawn structure is somewhat solidified. This queen repositioning aims to activate the monarch's support system and potentially exert pressure along the c-file, preparing for future pawn pushes or troop redeployments that could challenge black's central grip. Challenging the queenside structure, black initiates a pawn break, aiming to exploit the open files that might soon appear and disrupt white's seemingly solid setup. The opened file beckons, potentially a swift avenue for your rook. Be mindful of how black might contest it. Reasserting presence on the central diagonal. This knight's maneuver aims to dismantle white's queenside pawn structure and create dynamic counterplay, potentially opening lines for the rook on h8 and freeing up the g7 bishop. A decisive blow aimed at shattering black's queenside pawn structure, potentially opening vital lines towards the enemy king. Initiating a dynamic knight repositioning towards the kingside. This move aims to exploit the potentially exposed white king by creating threats of attack. This knight sidestep aims to reposition towards the kingside, seeking opportunities on f6 or g5, while simultaneously defending the c4 square and preparing to advance the b-pawn, potentially opening lines against black's castled position. A bold assertion of influence on the kingside. This knight's embarkation signals an aggressive intention, potentially creating weaknesses around white's monarch by forking the king and queen should the pawn structure shift unfavorably. The immediate exchange on d6 throws a wrench into black's carefully constructed knight maneuvering, forcing a decision that either consolidates white's central influence or opens lines that could become a liability for the kingside. Reclaiming central space and entangling the knight's position is the immediate priority. Accepting a slight outpost for white's knight in exchange for opening a path for the queen and preparing to challenge the now vulnerable d6 pawn. A bold gambit to seize control of the c-file. This knight's placement creates immediate pressure on black's queenside and forces a re-evaluation of defensive structures, potentially isolating the black king should the queenside crumble. The rook's journey to the kingside, aiming for support along the now open a-file, signals black's intent to challenge white's queenside space advantage and potentially disrupt the pawn chain's integrity. reclaiming the open c-file for potential pressure. This redeployment of the rook aims to galvanize the queenside and challenge black's otherwise solid pawn structure, while simultaneously defending the vulnerable b-pawn after the recent exchanges. Opening the e-file invites a direct confrontation, a bold gambit to dismantle the center and exploit potential weaknesses around white's monarch before a full development can be solidified. This recapture, while seemingly forced, opens up the f-file, a critical element that white has been aiming to exploit with the kingside pawn structure. Observe how the e4 pawn now stands isolated, a potential target for black's active pieces, particularly the knight that has just retreated. The immediate consequence is a shift in the dynamic. White's central pawn push from earlier has now created a weakness, potentially leading to increased activity for black's pieces on the queenside and a future assault on the kingside if white isn't careful. Shifting the bishop to the flank aims to improve its diagonal scope, potentially influencing the queenside pawns while preparing for a more active role in the ensuing middle game skirmish. A sharp pawn thrust is met with a repositioning of a key knight, aiming to disrupt black's central control and exploit the potential weakness on d6. Sensing an opportunity, black boldly redirects the rook from the flank towards the enemy's central fortifications, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for attack, showcasing an aggressive positional shift. Unlocking the d-file and opening lines toward black's king is the primary intention here, as the bishop vacates the square and prepares to participate in the central struggle. This capture isn't just about material exchange. It's a calculated attempt to disrupt black's pawn structure and create vulnerabilities in the queenside defense that were previously solidified. Consider how this action reshapes the positional landscape, potentially isolating black's pieces and forcing them to defend passively. The long-term implications of freeing up this diagonal could prove decisive. Offering the exchange like this immediately after white's bishop capture opens up the f-file with decisive effect, forcing the rook onto a much more active square and aiming directly at the king's defenses. This seemingly simple exchange is a tactical masterstroke, a calculated risk that prioritizes attacking initiative over material equality. A decisive exchange, opening the f-file for the rook and immediately threatening the king's safety. A critical shift in the positional landscape. The newfound central control for black's pawn, now firmly anchored on f4, offers a surprising degree of influence, potentially hindering white's rook on the g-file and demanding careful attention. Asserting pressure along the newly opened light squares. This queen repositioning aims to exploit the exposed black king and create immediate attacking chances. Shifting the knight to the queenside opens up lines for the remaining pieces, aiming to contest the crucial central files that white has somewhat neglected after the pawn structure concessions. Fortifying the kingside against potential knight incursions and preventing immediate threats on the g2 pawn. This move subtly aims to solidify white's defensive structure while keeping options open for future pawn advancements or piece regrouping. Preparing to contest the d-file after the rook exchange. This knight subtly repositions, aiming to reinforce the kingside defense and potentially reroute towards more active squares like e5. Disrupting white's pawn structure and creating a more robust defensive setup against any immediate threats. Consolidating pieces behind the pawn chain. White aims to improve the knight's position while preparing for future central operations. Unleashing the knight towards the vulnerable kingside. This aggressive thrust aims to disrupt white's harmony and exploit any potential weakness around the king. Look for opportunities to create mating nets or infiltrate enemy territory. unleashing a double-edged tactical storm. This knight sacrifice disrupts black's nascent coordination and aims to pry open the kingside by exploiting the unprotected f7 square. Black's queen now steps into a centralizing role, potentially preparing a dangerous pincer with the knight on g5, while simultaneously defending the f7 pawn and eyeing white's somewhat exposed king. This strategic repositioning subtly aims to solidify the kingside while potentially preparing for a queenside push or a central expansion by reinforcing the pawn structure. Black's knight, after a journey from e7, now occupies a very active central square, disrupting white's pawn structure and threatening both the f2 pawn and the white queen. The queen's retreat opens up a crucial diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's knight outposts and potentially exploit weaknesses around the king. Unleashing a devastating tactical sequence, black gambles everything on a sudden piece raid, aiming to shatter white's central control and expose the monarch. Seizing the opportunity, white resolves the immediate king's safety concerns and initiates a decisive material advantage, fundamentally altering the game's complexion. Snapping up the pawn, black initiates a dramatic material exchange, aiming to simplify the board while simultaneously opening avenues for their queen and knight to become more active. This audacious capture not only recovers material but also re-energizes black's attacking prospects, forcing white to carefully consider their response to avoid falling further behind in piece activity. The rook sacrifice, while unexpected, opens up avenues for piece activity and threatens to disrupt white's already awkward pawn structure. This exchange simplifies the position significantly, ushering in an endgame where the rook's infiltration on the f-file, even after white's capture, grants black immediate attacking potential and opens a clear path to white's king.